Okay, good morning. Let's spend a moment just because we've been on a long journey since Daf Gimel Amabet, addressing a particular question that the Gemara has been trying to figure out, specifically explaining a brisa that we learned almost a week ago. So let's just go over that. So again, the brisa said that Yibum and Chalitza do not apply when the widow of the deceased brother has one of the 15 relationships with the surviving, with the widow of the deceased brother has one of the 15 relationships with the surviving brother. And that the reason for that is because of Gzeira Shava involving the word Aleha. Aleha appears both in Vayikra Yudchet regarding the prohibition of marrying one's sister, and in Dvarim Kav Hey regarding Yibum. The problem was, so that was great that because of this Gzeira Shava, we're going to say that it's prohibited to marry the widow when she has one of these relationships. Specifically, we learn it from the wife-sister relationship. So that would be Reuven and Levi marry Rachel and Leah, and now Levi dies without any children. So Reuven can't marry Leah because he's already married to Rachel, Leah's sister. So that is the paradigmatic situation. That's the situation explicitly dealt with in the Torah. And we say that the Aleha means, the Aleha Gzeira Shava means that we don't do Yibum in that situation. So the problem is that why did we need that drasha to tell us? Why would we possibly have even thought that we would allow Reuven to marry Leah in that situation? That is a Torah prohibited relationship, and so there's no basis to allow it. And we said we went through maybe because of Aseh Docha Lo Taseh, but we ended up saying that Aseh Docha Lo Taseh doesn't work when the penalty is kares. And so we ended up coming up with three explanations. For how this Gzeira Shava made sense. So again, on Gimel on Mabet, we had the Gzeira Shava, Aleha, and we said that is what teaches us that about the prohibitions that we learned in our Mishnah. That's the source, that's the basis for those prohibitions. But again, why would we say those prohibitions wouldn't exist? Of course they would exist. They're prohibited in the Torah. Why do I need the Aleha Gzeira Shava? So we came up with three possible explanations. Explanation number one is based on an analogy, a mamatzinu. And we said that and we combine that with the concept of once something is permitted, we'll permit it in other situations as well. And so just like a Metzora is permitted to stick their thumb into the courtyard in order to have blood placed on it, even though a Metzora by his very nature is Tameh, so too will allow a Metzora who that morning is a Balkeri and has a seminal emission and therefore is not allowed to go into to stick his finger into the courtyard. So we'll allow him as well to stick his finger into the courtyard so that he can finish his tahara process, so that night, if it's Erev Pesach, so that night he will be able to eat from the Korban Pesach. So that was, so we said similarly, just as we expanded that permission, we'll expand the following permission, that if in fact the surviving brother had a moment when he was able to marry the widow. So again, we have Reuven and Levi marrying Rachel and Leah. But before Reuven marries Rachel, and now that Levi is married to Leah, Levi dies without any children. And so now Reuven is required to marry or to do chalitza with Leah. And so, but before he does so, he marries Leah's sister Rachel. So now Reuven has married Rachel, and so now if Leah becomes his wife as well, he'll be married to two sisters. And so the explanation is we might have thought that since before he married Rachel, he was allowed to marry Leah, and since there's a specific requirement for him to do so, and we have a Mamatzinu that says that these cases are analogous to this case is analogous to just the general brother marrying a brother's wife at all situation, which is the basis and the underlying facts always associated with Yibum. So we'll allow him to marry, we'll allow Reuven to marry Leah even after he has married Rachel, just as we have allowed the Mitzorah to stick his thumb into the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash even after he has become a Balkari. And so that is the reason that we might have thought that it would be allowed for Reuven to marry these 15 relationships that were said in our original Mishnah, but because of Allah, we're going to prohibit it. And so now we've explained our Brisa on Gimel Amabet. So that was explanation number one. Explanation number two is very similar, but it's based on a Hekesh that, again, where the Torah connects marrying a brother's wife to all other arayot. So just as we permit marrying a brother's wife in the context of Yibum, we should permit all the other arayot in the context of Yibum. And therefore, we have the Gzera Shava of Aleha to tell us, no, we don't actually apply that Hekesh. And then explanation number three is really, we would never, ever think about marrying any erva, any of the relations in the 15 relationships in our Mishnah, nor would we allow any of the co-wives, because we have sukkim that make that very clear, that say that. However, what would we potentially say without the again, because we do not say ase doka lotase, where the punishment is kares, and the penalty to marry an erva or her co-wife is kares. So but what does the Gzera Shava of Allah tell us? It tells us that while we might have thought that we should allow co-wives in the context of Yibum and prohibit them when no mitzvah is involved, since usually one would be more lenient in the context of a mitzvah, we actually prohibit co-wives in the context of Yibum, but permit co-wives outside the context of Yibum. So what do I mean by outside the context of Yibum? Very simple. Reuven's daughter Dinah marries Shimon, to whom he has no relationship. Shimon also marries Shoshana. So now Shimon dies. Shoshana is totally allowed to marry Reuven. There is no prohibition whatsoever for Reuven to marry Shoshana, even though Shoshana was a co-wife of his daughter Dinah, because co-wives doesn't matter outside the context of Yibum. And so that is what we learn from the drasha, from the Gzera Shava of Aleha. So those were three different answers to the question of how come the Gzera Shava of Aleha makes a difference. How come, why we even need it. Now, the problem is during the course of that discussion, we also came across a brisa in which Rebbe develops an alternate derivation of the prohibition of co-wives. He does not use this drasha of the Gzera Shava of Aleha, but rather he notes that instead of ulakach, it says ulkacha, that we're going to take her, not just take, but take her, somehow specifying a particular wife. And so he says that, what does that teach us? That teaches us that Yibum only applies where the Yavam could choose any of the deceased brother's co-wives. So what does that imply? That implies that if one of the co-wives was an erva, meaning if Reuven's daughter Dinah marries Levi, Levi is also married to Leah, and so now now Levi dies without any children. So of course Reuven can't marry Dinah because Dinah is his daughter. But not only can he not marry Dinah, but he can't marry any of Dinah's co-wives. And so as a result, and the reason is because Ul Kacha suggests that that the Yavam, namely Ruvain, has to be able to take any of the wives. Now he can only marry one of them because that's the process of Yibum. You only marry one of the ex-wives. But the point is of the widows. But the point is that they you might have thought that that the other co-wives with whom he has no relationship, Shoshana is not his daughter. It's only the fact that she was a co-wife with Dinah, but the pasuk says that ulkacha, he needs to be able to marry all of them, and if he can't marry all of them, then he can't marry any of them. So that is ulkacha. And then what does the Yevamot tell us? The Yevamot tells us that when it comes to the prohibition of marrying co-wives, it only applies in the context of Yibum. Well, of course, what we've just said shows that with everything that we learned out of Aleha, based on those three possible explanations that we've seen over the last week, none of them apply for Rebbe. So now our Gemara asks, what does Rebbe do with that Aleha drasha? How does he use the word Aleha in Vayikra Yud Chet and in connection with the marrying of a wife's sister, and in Dvarim Kaf Hey Hey, where it talks about Yibum? So how does he use that Aleha? So the Rebbe, Hi Aleha, my Avidle. So this is where now last word, fourth line from the bottom on Chet Amabet, and now we're going to continue. The Rebbe, Hi Aleha, my Avidle. What does he do with that Aleha? So mi boile likatanya. He needs it, as the following brisa will show. Now, let me pause by noting that this brisa is not going to clearly use the word Aleha, but what we will do is, and we're going to not only learn this brisa, but we're going to also learn a Mishnah that is similar to the brisa, and then finally we'll get to the role that Aleha plays in this brisa and the Mishnah that we're going to quote. This brisa and the Mishnah that we're going to quote have nothing to do with Yibum. They have everything to do with a chatas, with a sin offering. And in particular, we're going to talk about the particular animals that are given for different kinds of sins, because depending on the nature of the sin will determine the nature of the sin offering. And indeed, that is precisely this is a nice Daf Yomi coincidence, because our parshios, the parsha last week, Vayikra, and the parsha this coming week of Tzav, deal with these issues of the chatas offering. So, what does the brisa tell us? Ein chayavim based in ela al davar shezidono kares b'shigagoso chatas. That when one of the different kinds of sin offerings that exist is for where a Beit Din makes a mistake, and as a result, the community does some action that is prohibited. So when does that obligation for the Beit Din to offer a sin offering exist? It only exists if the violation is something where, if it was intentional, the penalty would be kares, and if it was, and as a result, and if it's accidental sin, would involve a chatas. And similarly, the anointed Kohen, namely the Kohen Gadol, if he makes a mistake and the entire community, as a result of his mistake, sins, then he also, the only way that he would be obligated to offer the sin offering, that the special sin offering in that situation, is if the sin that everybody or that the sin that he does as a result of his own psak is only if he sins in a sin that otherwise would result in, for a normal person, if it was intentional, it would be kares, and when it's unintentional, it would be a chatas. Okay, and now we turn to Daf Tet Amud Aleph, our daf for today. Below ba'avodas kochavim, and similarly, the special offering that a Beit Din has to, or that a community has to bring, which is a special as Rashi says, the Lova al Ba'odas Kochavim, the first Rashi on Daf Tet Amud Aleph, there ain't chayv in Tzibur, the community is not obligated lahevi parla olah to bring a bull for an olah, the seir lechatas, and a goat for a sin offering. That which is a special double offering obligation for when a community accidentally or unintentionally engages in avodah zara. That's only chayiv ella al davar shechayvin al zedono kares v'shikigos chatas. It's only obligated where the sin that it does is in connection with something, with the action of idolatry that they do would otherwise result in a penalty of kares, or if it was unintentional, it would result in a chatas for an individual, a sin offering. Utanan nami, and we have a Mishnah that basically says a very similar thing. Kol mitzvah Torah, every commandment in the Torah shechayvin al zadonos kares, where one is obligated for kares if one violates it intentionally, al shigagoso chatas, and where an unintentional violation triggers a chatas offering. Yachad maybe kisba os ira, an individual brings a female lamb or a female goat. Nasi, a president, the head of the community, the king, whoever's the top person in the community, if they sin, maybe seir, he brings a he goat. Mashiach uveistin maybe in par. If it is the Kohen Gadol or a court that has ruled incorrectly, they bring a bull as the sin offering. Uva'avodas kochavim, and when it comes to idolatry, Yachid Nasi Umashiach Mavian Sira, an individual, the head of the community or the Kohen Gadol, would bring a she-goat. Sibur Mavian Par B'Sa'ir, the community would bring a bull, as we saw, le'olah, for an olah, and a seir as a sin offering. Par le'olah, the seir lechatas, exactly as Rashi said at the top of the page. So all of that has not yet told us what we do with aleha, but now we're going to do that by going into the details. So mina hani mili, how do we know any of this? And now we understand we're going to get to the concept of aleha, the Tana Rabbanan, because we have another brisa that now tells us the explanation, and that explanation is going to involve the aleha psukim, v'noda'a hachata ser shachatu aleha. So the brisa says that the pasuk in Vayikra Dalid Yud Dalid, which was last week's parsha, the pasuk said that when, and it's talking about a communal sin. So when the sin regarding that, the sin that they made, when it becomes known, so asher chatu aleha. So the point is that aleha is in that pasuk. So nemar kan aleha. So that pasuk has aleha. The nemar lahalan aleha, and it says elsewhere aleha. Well, guess which aleha we're going to have? It's the aleha of later in Vayikra Yudchet, the prohibition of marrying a sister's wife. A wife's sister, the prohibition of marrying a wife's sister. So malahalan, just as over there, the context of a wife's sister, davar shechayavin al zidono kares, it is something that if you do intentionally, you are liable for kares, meaning that you get cut off from the community, al shigaso chatas, and you are liable for unintentional. If you do it unintentionally, you have to bring a chatas offering. So afkan, so too here in connection with the communal offering, communal mistake, shechayavim ale al zedono kares. We're only talking about when you have to bring a sin offering. We're talking about where the sin by an individual would be one where it's liable for kares if you did it intentionally, and where you do it if you did it unintentionally, you would be chayav achatas. So we see we have another use for that aleha gzeira shava. It's not a gzeira shava to dvarim where we talk about yibum, but it is a gzeira shava from the context of Yudchet of Vayikra Yudchet of the marrying a wife's sister. And so as a result, we've used that aleha there. And so as a result, that's why that helps us understand how it is that Rebbe would use the aleha and not as opposed to the rabbis. So Ashkechan Tzibor. So all right. So we're going to now, we've explained how Rebbe uses aleha, but since we raised all of these different kinds of sacrifices, and we've said that all of them apply where we're dealing with where an individual, if they sinned intentionally, they would be liable to kares, and unintentional, they'd be obligated to bring a chatas. How you've explained how you learned it in connection with the community offering, but there were lots of other offerings that we've talked about. And how do we know that all of them have that threshold of that the nature of the sin that one needs to do in order to bring a sin offering is that it was the same kind of sin that for an individual one would be chayav kares, and for the community you would be and for the unintentional sin the individual would be liable for a chatas. So Ashkechan Tzibor. So now the Gemara says again, we found that the need, that the threshold for the community, namely that a chatas is for an error where the prohibition is would otherwise, if you did it intentionally, result in kares for an individual. Mashiach minolan. How do I know that that's the same threshold for a Kohen Gadol? So Diksiv b'Mashiach la'ashmas ha'am, because when it talks about in also last week's parsha, when it talks about the offering of the Kohen Gadol, it says by the guilt of the nation. So Harei Mashiach Katzibor. So the fact that that in connection with the Kohen Gadol's sin, we reference the nation, so that shows that the Kohen Gadol's threshold is just like the threshold for a communal error, namely a kares level prohibition. So Yachid v'Nasi, what about a person, an individual, and and the king? How about them? So mitzvos, we have a gzeira shava, because those the word mitzvot is written in connection with both of them, also again in this past week's parsha. So below avodas kachavim. Well, what about avodas kachavim? That ella al davar shechayvin al zidono kares al shigbiga sochatas. When we said in our brisa that with respect to the idolatry, you're only obligated if it's something where the intentional violation is chayav kares and the unintentional violation obligates one for a chatas. So how do I know all that? So tzibor ba'avodas kochavim, the communal error in connection with idolatry, yolaf me'ene. We'll learn that from a gzeira shava of the word me'ene, because the concept of idolatry being obligated in a sin offering when done accidental, that actually comes up in Parshas Shlach in Sefer Bamidbar, in Perek Yud Hey of Bamidbar, and so there it says me'ene, and similarly in Vayikra in the Psukim where it talks about a communal idolatry, we also a communal error, not idolatry. It also talks about me'ene. So we learn the communal sin, the threshold for communal sin of idolatry from the communal sin of other sins that we mentioned in the first hand. So again, we learn the communal sins by other sins other than idolatry from the aleha drasha that we mentioned at the beginning, and now we've learned from the communal sins to communal sins of idolatry from a gzeira shava of me'ene, because me'ene, the word me'ene both exists in Vayikra Daled Yud Gimel and in Bamidbar Tesvav Kaf Daled. Okay, so Yachid v'Nasi u'Mashiach. What about an individual, the president, the king, and the Kohen Gadol? Mi'v'im nefesh achat. So there we're going to, what about their situations of idolatry? So in the discussion in Sefer Bamidbar, it talks about im nefesh achat. If there was one soul, So all of those situations, an individual, a ruler, and the Kohen Gadol, are all a particular individual sinning. So Echad Yachid Echad Nasi Echad Mashiach B'mashma. So it implies all any kind of single individual, any kind of one person would be covered. Vav Mosif al Inyan Rishon, and the Vav of V'im Nefesh Achad comes to add to the previous concept, to the topic that was just immediately before it, namely communal idolatry. So just as communal idolatry is triggered by only idolatry that would cause one to be liable kares, and not idolatry that would or if it's unintentional, it would be chayav chatas. So too, the idolatry of an individual will only trigger the obligation to bring a chatas if it is the kind of idolatry that is chayav kares. By the way, I'll note that Rashi, during the course of this, explains what are we talking about in that regard, and he notes that when we talk about idolatry that is chayev, if we take a look all the way up at the second Rashi on the second line, Ella al davar shechayven al zadonos karas al shigos ochatas, kagon zivuach, like bringing an offering, the kitor, or burning incense, the nisuch, and doing libations, vishtachava, and doing bowing. So all four of those things, those would trigger a kares prohibition if you do them with respect to idolatry. But if you just were to hug an idol or to kiss an idol, that would not actually trigger kares. And so as a result, those things, if somebody were to do them either on an individual level or a communal level, in any kind of those situations, they would not actually trigger a chatas offering if they were done accidentally, and they would not trigger kares if they were done intentionally. So, all right. So vav mosif al, back into the Gemara. Vav mosif al inyan rishon. The vav adds to the prior discussion. The yomad tachton min ha'elyon, and we learn from the earlier passage to the later passage, and so as a result, that is the explanation. So we've explained the entire Brisa and Mishnah that we've quoted. But of course, the only reason that we needed to quote it was to show that Rebbe has use for the Aleha in Vayikra Yudchet Yudchet, because he has a Gzeira Shava from there to the discussion of communal sin offerings. So now the Gemara turns back to the rabbis, because the rabbis don't have that Aleha in Vayikra Yudchet Yudchet to learn the drasha that Rebbe did. So v'Rabbanan haisvaraman, how do they derive the concept that a chatas offering is required for a community sin only if the community sin is one that is a kares prohibition? So nafgalahu midamakri le Rabbi Yoshua lebrei. They derive it from what Rabbi Yoshua taught his son. Torah achas yiyeh lachem le'osa b'shgaga. That it says in Parshas Shlach, in Sefer Bamidbar, Perek Tesvav Pasuk Chavtet, it says one law. There's going to be one law for for one who acts unintentionally. So what does that mean by one law? Torah achas. So and it says v'hanefesh asher taseh b'yad ramah. And then in the next pasuk, it says that the person who acts high, with a high hand, so that is a specific prohibition. That tells us, a high-handed prohibition is specifically understood by the Gemara to refer to idolatry. So we see that there is one rule associated with idolatry. So huksha kol haTorah kula la'avodas akochavim. So the entire Torah are compared to idolatry with respect to chatas. So ma avodas kochavim davar shechayavin al zadono kares bal shigagoso chatas, that just as when it comes to idolatry, that when is one chayav achatas, it's only when one is liable for kares. Avkol davar shechayavin al zadono kares bal shigagoso chatas. So too, whenever the intentional violation is going to be kares, the unintentional violation will be a chatas. One will be obligated to bring a chatas. So that is how, by connecting that verse, so now we've got an understanding of the same thing that we covered in the Brisa and the Mishnah that we just quoted about all the different kinds of obligations. Well, Ashkechan Yachid b'Nesiv Mashiach. Well, that tells us the context of those two psukim was about an individual. So, bein ba'avodas kochavim, bein b'shar mitzvos. So we see that when it comes to an individual, a king or a Kohen Gadol, whether the sin is avodah zarah or the sin is whether the sin is avodah zarah or the sin is any other sin, we see that the threshold is for a chatas offering does that sin violation, if done intentionally, result in kares. But what about sibur ba'avodas kochavim minayin? How do I know about a communal sin? We've only shown that there's this connection in connection with an individual sin, not in connection with communal sins of idolatry. So Amar or not idolatry and non-idolatry. So Amar Kra v'im nefesh, right? So the pasuk says v'im nefesh, if one person. So the point is that the same thing that we quoted just a moment ago, connecting the individual to the community. So v'yilmad elyon mitachton. So whereas earlier we said that we'll learn the tachton from the elyon, we'll learn the latter passage from the earlier passage. Now we're going to say the exact opposite, because the point is the juxtaposition of the two contexts in Parshas Shlach is that we first say that we deal first with the communal avodah zarah, then we deal with the individual avodah zarah, and so since those two are next to each other, we can learn one from the other. So since we already know now, according to the rabbis, that the individual sin of avodah zarah is tied to whether or not the action would make you chayav kares if you did it intentionally, so too for the community. The only time that the community would be obligated in the chatas if they did an action where an individual would be chayav kares if they did it intentionally. So elat sibur b'shar mitzvos. Well, what about the community by all other mitzvahs? So yeah, so you've got the two you've covered. We've now covered every individual and the community in connection with idolatry, but that still leaves the community in connection with other sins. How do I know that threshold also is one of where the sin is that the community does is a sin where an individual would have to be chayav kares, otherwise or more. Otherwise, you would not be obligated in a communal sin offering. So minalan. So how do I know that? So again, yalav me'enei me'enai. So while Rebbe learned the me'enei in the other direction, learned from the other sins to the avodah zarah sin, here we're going to go in the other direction. We now know that the avodah zarah sin for a community, that the threshold is davar shechayavin al zadono kares. That's something where if you sin intentionally, you're chayav kares. So me'enei, the Gezerah Shava will tell us that also by a communal sin, by other communal sins other than avodah zarah, the threshold also is a davar shechayavin al zadono kares, is where you're chayav kares if you sin intentionally. So now we've explained how both Rebbe and the rabbis can learn all the same laws. But now the Rebbe, hi Torah achas my avidlei. Well, you used a very interesting thing to teach that, the rabbis did. They learned Torah Achat, a single law. Well, what does Rebbe use that for? So the Gemara answers, Mi boile, look at it, Tanya. He needs it like a brisa that specifically taught. What did the brisa teach? Teach lefishim matzinu shechilik hakasav ben yechidim lemerubim. Since we see that the Torah differentiates between individuals and groups who engage in idolatry. Why? What's the difference? Specifically, if an individual, well, actually, we're going to say yechidim beskila, an individual who sins with idolatry, he gets stoned. Lefikach mamonam palat, and his money is spared because that death penalty of stoning is so severe. Merubin b'sayif. However, the multitude, when a bunch of people and a whole city ends up engaging in idolatry, well, then we have what's known as an ir hanidachat, and all those people, they are not subject to the death penalty of stoning. They're subject to the death penalty of the sword, namely beheading. Lefikach mamonam aved, and as a result, all their property is destroyed. So yachol nachlok b'karmana seihin. So since we have a difference between a single a person who engages in idolatry intentionally and a communal group that engages in idolatry intentionally, we have different punishments for them. Yachol nachlok b'karmana seihin. I might have thought that we should also have and differentiate between a single person who sins with idolatry inadvertently and a person and a communal community that sins with idolatry inadvertently, that they should also have different chatas offerings in that situation. Talmud Lomar, Torah chasi yelachem. There should be just one Torah for you. And so as a result, that Torah Achat tells us that in fact there's both a single individual and a community that sins with idolatry. If they sin inadvertently, they're going to bring the same sin offering. Well, Maskif Rav Chilkiah from Hargonia asks and questions this. You're going to tell me that the only reason that we're going to have the same offering for both an individual and a group is because we have the words Torah Chasi Yelachem. Well, 1 second. Hi Lav Hachi. That implies that if we didn't have those words, Hava Amina Nachlok, we would have a different offering. Well, my light to. What would that different offering be? Meaning it's got to be different, right? So light to par. Are you going to tell him that he's going to bring a bull? Well, 1 second. Sibur b'shar mitzvos hu demaitu. That's what everybody else brings. That's what a community brings if they sin with respect to a different commandment. Kispa, if you talk about a female lamb, yachid b'shar mitzvos hu demaisi. That's what a people bring for what an individual brings with respect to a regular sin. Sa'ir, if you're talking about a he-goat, nasi b'shar mitzvos hu demaisi. That's what a king brings when it comes to other sins. Parla ola v'sayir lachatas, and if you're going to say, well, he'll bring a bull as an ola and a he-goat as a chatas. Well, tzibor bavo kochavim hu demaisu. That is exactly what the tzibor, what a whole community brings when it sins involving idolatry, not just a single group. When it's an entire tribe. The elamai seira. So what you want? Going to have her bring? Have the group bring a she-goat? Well, yachinami hainu carbano. That's exactly what an individual idolater would bring, is a she-goat. So basically, we've eliminated any possibility. So basically, why do you need to tell me anything? The only thing that they could possibly bring is the same offering as for an individual. So no, it's strict. It is necessary. That since if the community sins in a case of national or full tribal idolatry as a result of a improper ruling from the Sanhedrin, since they bring a bull as an ola and a he-goat as a chatas. So maybe I would say, let's just do the opposite. And we'll bring a he-goat as an ola and a bull as a chatas. That will be different from everything else. And it would, and so it will be different from everything else. And so that will allow us to differentiate and everything will be wonderful. And inami, or maybe sarach ve'ein lo takana, or maybe you could say ein hakanami. There is no thing that could be brought that would be different, and so there wouldn't be anything to be brought. So kamash malan. That's why the Torah says the Torah achat. That's why it says Torah achat, that there's one law that applies both to an individual who sins unintentionally with respect to idolatry, and when a group sins unintentionally with respect to idolatry. And so, namely, that is that they would all bring a she-goat, and that would be the only offering. So, Amar le Levi le Rebbe. So Levi says to Rebbe. So now, pause. We're going to now, we've concluded the discussion that we've been on. We've concluded the trip that we've been on for more than a week, or for basically a week and a day, since Gimel Amabet, and we've answered all the questions. We've figured everything out. And now the question is, do we have the right 15 items in our Mishnah? In particular, Levi is going to say, it sounds like one thing might be missing from our Mishnah. So Amar le Levi le Rabbi, Ma'ir Yuditani Chameshes Rei. Why is it that our Mishnah taught us 15? Lisnei Sheishes Rei. It could have taught us 16. So Rebbe is going to react very sharply here. Amar le Kimeduma li she'ein lo moach b'kad kado. It seems like he has no brain in his head. So the Chavos Yair famously has a tshuva where he goes through all of the insults that are in the Gemara to try and explain them as that they're not really, that they're all efforts to encourage learning, etc., and that really we need to be kind to one another. So in any event, clearly Rebbe thought that Levi could do better. So my daitcha, what are you thinking about? Imo anusa aviv, you're thinking about a woman that was violated by the father of the Yavam. So here we're dealing with the following: Yaakov violates Sarah. All right, and now that Yaakov has violated Sarah, so now after that happened, Yaakov's sons, Ruvain and Levi, so Levi marries Sarah. And so now Levi has married Sarah, but Levi has no children. And so now Ruvain has the opportunity to do Yibum. So, and I should note, I forgot to mention this, that Ruvain is the daughter of that rape of Yaakov of Sarah. So now, of course, he should not be able to marry his mother, and so as a result, he also shouldn't be able to marry any of the co-wives. So that would be the situation that we're going to suggest that maybe Levi intended. So imo anusas aviv plukta the Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbananhi. But the issue is that this is a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. And plukta lo kamairi. What's the debate? The debate is, and we saw this debate before, Rabbi Yehuda holds that it's forbidden for a man to marry a woman whom his father violated. And so as a result, Levi was not allowed to marry Sarah in the first place. And so as a result, that's why she could never have a yibum with anybody. And so as a result, there's no possibility of co-wives in that situation, because she's never allowed, nobody's allowed to marry her in the first place. So in that situation, there can't be a co-wife of a co-wife, because none of Yaakov's children will be able to marry any of her co-wives. Unlike the 15 situations in our Mishnah, where it's possible for one of the brothers to have a specific relationship. Remember the classic case of Reuven's daughter Dinah marries Levi, Levi marries Dinah and Leah. Levi dies without any children, and now Reuven is not only not allowed to marry Dinah, his daughter, but he's also not allowed to marry Leah because she was Dinah's co-wife. So, but in the situation where Levi marries Sarah and Leah, where Levi marries Sarah, who is Reuven's mom, through a rape situation, well, none of the other brothers are allowed to marry Leah because all the brothers are prohibited, including Levi, but he married her anyway, of marrying Sarah. So as a result, none of the brothers could end up marrying Leah, and so there could never be a situation of a co-wife of a co-wife. And so that's why it wasn't listed in our Mishnah, because there was a dispute associated. The the Gemara challenges the fact that there was that our Mishnah doesn't deal with disputes. And so what we're going to now do is we're going to try 3 different times to show that there are disputes. At least I think it's 3. Let's go through and we'll count them. The Haray Isser Mitzvah Isser Kedusha. 1 second. We have the things that are prohibited rabbinically and things that are prohibited biblically. The Pligi Rabbi Akiva Rabbanan. We're going to learn. So the implication, the first understanding of Rebbe's comment about that in our Mishnah, we're not talking about it, is that the Mishnayos in Yevamot don't talk about machlokos. But we're going to see in a Mishnah in the second parak that the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva do disagree with respect to certain categories. The Katani, and we've learned it in a Mishnah. So no, the Gemara explains, but Pirkin Ka'amrinan, we're talking about in our chapter. Well, 1 second. Well, 1 second. Beis Shammai doesn't believe in this whole concept of co-wives. It's only Beit Hillel who forbids it. So our Mishnah, the Mishnah that began our parak, does involve some topic of dispute. Well, Beis Shammai b'mokom Beis Hillel ain't a Mishnah. So that is not, we never, Beis Shammai, when you compare it to Beis Hillel, that is not a real dispute, because we know that we paskin like Beis Hillel, we paskin like Beis Hillel. So as a result, Beis Shammai is not a relevant disputant. So as a result, that won't stop us from quoting the law in our Mishnah. So now the third rejection. What about the brother who was born after the decease, after the brother who dies without children has died? So again, let's remember, let's go through the situation. So Levi marries Leah. We're going to do a very simple situation. Levi marries Leah, and now he dies without any children. After Levi has died, Reuven is born. Well, there's no yibum in that situation, and we can make it even a little more complicated, and we'll still say that there's no yibum. So Levi dies with Reuven and Levi are brothers, and Levi dies, and now after marrying Leah, he has no children, and so now Reuven marries Leah as a yibum, and now Shimon is born, and now unfortunately Reuven dies as well. So now not only can because Leah was the wife of Levi, who died before Shimon was born, Shimon is unable not only to marry Leah, but he cannot even marry any of Leah's co-wives. That was the situation that we talked about in our Mishnah. So now, but that is in fact a machlokas, the Peligi Rabbi Shimon the Rabbanan. The rabbis and Rabbi Shimon disagree. The Ketani, and yet we learned it. Well, what was the disagreement? The disagreement is that Shimon says that in that situation that I just discussed, that because Reuven has already married Leah, now that Shimon is born, Reuven and Leah are a true husband and wife, and there's no more ramifications of the relationship that Levi had with Leah. So it doesn't matter. So the Nolad Lubasofim. So okay, but there is a situation where even Rabbi Shimon agrees to the problem of a brother being born after the other brother dies. What's the situation? So again, we're going to have Reuven, Levi, and Shimon. So Levi marries Leah. Reuven is alive. Levi dies, but before Reuven does Yibum with Leah, so now Shimon is born. So Shimon is born in that in-between time. So at that moment, when Leah is not yet married to anybody, Leah is not allowed to marry Shimon because Shimon was not alive when Levi died. And so as a result, since Shimon didn't coexist with Levi when he was alive, so he's not allowed to do Yibum, even though Yibum hasn't yet happened. And so since that's a situation, lo pali Rabbi Shimon, since Rabbi Shimon doesn't disagree in that situation, that is not considered a disagreement. So Bahamar Rav Oshia Chalakaya Rabbi Shimon Afarisha. Now 1 second. Rav Oshia says that even in that situation, Rabbi Shimon does disagree. Well, no, Ha'itosev Rabbi Oshia. We're going to refute Rabbi Oshia, and so we're going to see Rabbi Oshia in a little while. Not today, in a week or so, and so, but he will be refuted, and so as a result, we can still say, consistent with Rebbe, that our Mishnah is dealing only with a failure with no disagreements. So now we come to the fourth and final effort to prove that in fact our Mishnah does involve disagreements. Now, this one is complicated, so I'm gonna give you the basics. All right, but it's on the screen, and I think that can be very helpful. All right, we're going to deal with this in a Mishnah on Kaf Vav Amud Aleph, where we have Reuven, Levi, Shimon, and Yehuda. Reuven and Levi are married to sisters Rachel and Leah. Reuven and Levi die without children. Because they've died before anyone was able to do Yibum to the other one's wife, we now have two sisters that have fallen to Shimon and Yehuda. Well, because both of them are not able to marry both of those widows, so as a result, they are required to do chalitza, okay? And they're not allowed to marry either of them. However, if it turns out that Rachel has an erva relationship with Shimon, then Shimon's allowed to do Yibum with Leah. And so, for example, let's say the simple example is that, hold on, let me just remember the simple example. If Shimon, I have it, right? If Shimon is married to Rachel's daughter from a previous marriage, right? So now he's not allowed to marry, you're not allowed to marry a mother and daughter. And so as a result, Shimon can't marry Rachel, but he can marry Leah. So as a result, he's allowed to marry Leah. And similarly, if Leah has a erva relationship with Yehuda, so Yehuda, for example, had married Leah's daughter from a prior marriage. And so as a result, Yehuda is allowed to marry Rachel. So in that situation, and Rashi is going to go through how that you can see how humongous the Rashi is on Tedem and Bet. The Rashi goes through and shows how every one of the 15 relationships in our Mishnah could apply to these four brothers to enable Shimon to do Yibum with Leah, but not with Rachel, and Yehuda to do Yibum with Rachel, but not with Leah. Okay, so now we're going to have now that we have that background, let's look and see inside. V'hamar Rav Yehuda. Now again, Amar Rav. We're again trying to show that there is a machlokes in our Mishnah. that our Mishnah does deal with the topic about which there's an argument. So B'chein Tani Rabbi Yechia, we learned the statement of Rabbi Yechia. B'kulan ani korei behen. In all of them. Now, what all is, we're about to have an argument about that. But in all the situations in our Mishnah, in the first Mishnah of our Perek, hold on just a second. In all the Mishnah situations in the first Mishnah in our Perek, we can apply the thing that we're going to learn about on the Mishnah in Kaf Vav Amud Aleph. And that is, what is it that we're going to learn? The situation where the first two brothers have died, and one of their wives is forbidden to one of the brothers and permitted to that brother. And similarly, the opposite, that the one is forbidden to one brother is permitted to the other brother. So in each case, in the case that we just said, we have Leah is allowed to marry Yehuda, but not, Leah is allowed to marry Shimon, but not Yehuda, and Rachel's able to marry Yehuda, but not Shimon. And all of those can apply to each of the 15 situations in our Mishnah. So, so as a result, the person who's can choose whether he wants to do Yibum or Chalitza. That's he's able to make that decision, because each of those people are only in one issue. It's not a double problem. It's not both of the sisters being a problem, in which case you would have to do Chalitza. But Rabbi Yehuda metargim. Now Rabbi Yehuda interpreted that statement, that all, as michomosova elach, only from the mother-in-law cases onward in our Mishnah. Aval shita bave derisha lo, but not the 6 daughter cases that begin our Mishnah. So my time, and again, the details here aren't important, because the whole point that we're trying to get to is that there's an argument in our Mishnah. So I'm going to go through it a little quickly, because this is not relevant to the fact that we're going to say that there's an argument in our Mishnah. So my time, why don't the 6 first apply? Kaven de bedito, but onus in mishkachas, because those are situations where the daughter is a daughter through a violation, through somebody being violated, and not a marriage situation. So as a result, because those are not marriage situations, and benisuyin kamairi, and we're talking about, by definition, because the 2 brothers were married, we're talking about a marriage situation. But onus and lo kamairi, so we're not dealing with rape situations. But Abaye metargim apito, but Abaye says no, it can apply even to the daughter, from a rape situation. Again, once we can find one case, so we can find another case. So that once we have a situation that because it applies in a non-violation situation, so we'll also talk about the marriage situation. So the point is that it as long as there's some case of a daughter to which the teaching fits, we can say that it's reasonable to say that this case is included. So the point is that all the cases end up applying Rabbi Chia's statement. However, but when the situation where one of the brothers is not alive, that doesn't apply. So my timer, why not? Rabbi Shimon, who the mishkachasla, because we just said that it's only Rabbi Shimon. We have to find a situation where Rabbi Shimon allows where everybody agrees. So it means that we have to follow Rabbi Shimon's rule. Rabbi Shimon's rule is that a brother, that if the brother, that only when the brother, the not yet born brother, is born before the yibum happens, that's the only situation where that brother is not allowed to marry the widow. However, or the widow's co-wives, or the co-wives of co-wives, etc. But Rabbanan lo mishkachasla. But there's no way to have the situation of the 4 brothers with the 2 sisters according to the rabbis. So beplikta lo kamairi, and Rabbi Chia does not deal with cases that are in dispute. No, even in a situation where one of the brothers is not yet alive, because we can find a case of 6 brothers, and it can be just according to Rabbi Shimon. Mace nola b'yibim, mace nola b'yibim. And the sign of the situation is where we have death, then the brother is born, and then yibum happens. And if that happens twice, we can have a situation like the situation of the four brothers. So what does that mean? I'm going to have to wait till tomorrow to explain it. So that's going to be the teaser for tomorrow. Ella Rebbe. So as a result, we'll see that in fact our Mishnah does deal with a dispute. But that is going to take some time, and it's a little head spinning. So we're going to stop here before, and I won't get to the answer, and I'll pick up with the answer of how we deal with it. But first, I'll finish the question so that we can all understand the question, God willing, tomorrow. But that is going to be a toughie. So you don't want to miss it, because if you miss it, you'll be missing one of the most complicated logic issues that you'll see in the Gemara. So definitely something that you want to see. I'm going to pause, and then I want to just talk about timing for tomorrow. So hold on just a second.